If it's Tuesday, President Biden in full damage control as he battles intensifying concerns about his fitness for office amid new calls for him to withdraw and growing Democratic panic about stopping a newly emboldened Donald Trump in November. Plus, the former president and his lawyers seize on the Supreme Court's expansive view of presidential immunity as the judge in his criminal hush money case agrees to delay his sentencing until September to hear arguments about potentially throwing out his conviction. And fueled by warming waters and rapid intensification, Hurricane Beryl churns in the Caribbean and heads towards Jamaica as a powerful Category 4 storm. It is the earliest major hurricane ever to form in the Atlantic. Hi there, welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington. And the first Democratic lawmaker is now publicly calling on President Biden to withdraw from the presidential race as the Biden campaign faces growing pressure and criticism following that disastrous debate performance last week, and as a Supreme Court ruling has intensified fears about the stakes this November. This afternoon, Congressman Lloyd Doggett, who's known on Capitol Hill as an ardent Biden supporter, certainly not a flamethrower, put out a statement saying the president has failed to reassure voters that he can beat Trump. Congressman Doggett also cited yesterday's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, saying he believes a Trump victory could usher America into a, quote, dark authoritarian era. Doggett writes, in part, President Biden saved our democracy by delivering us from Trump in 2020. He must not deliver us to Trump in 2024. The Biden campaign reacting to Doggett's statement with a terse three-word statement of its own, saying he's staying in. It comes as the Biden campaign has also seized on the Supreme Court's ruling as a major reason for the president to stay in the race. Here was President Biden last night.
The presidency is the most powerful office in the world. It's an office that not only tests your judgment, perhaps even more importantly, it's an office that tests your character. Today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone. The American people must decide if they want to entrust the president once again, the presidency, to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it.
So the speech was also a clear attempt at damage control for the Biden campaign as other lawmakers speak publicly about wanting more proof the president is up to the job.
Your honest reaction to the debate?
I think, like a lot of people, I was pretty horrified. People want to make sure that this is a campaign that's ready to go and win, that the president and his team are being candid with us about his condition, that this was a real anomaly and not just the way he is these days.
I have this attitude. Thursday night was a bad night, and the president now has to go out and show the American people he can do the job, he's got the stamina, and he's up to it. One interview isn't going to fix this either. I think the campaign's got to listen to people, and by the way, I think the campaign needs to listen to us.
So their comments reflect growing frustration within the party, not just about the debate itself, but how the campaign has handled the backlash. Vermont Senator Pete Welch telling Semaphore, quote, I really do criticize the campaign for a dismissive attitude toward people who are just raising questions for discussion. That's just facing the reality we're in. And Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi says she's heard mixed reactions, saying it's fair to ask if Thursday's performance was a one-off or something more serious, as she urged the president to shift his strategy.
I think it's a legitimate question to say, is this an episode or is this a condition? I think my recommendation to is for him to have some interviews with serious journalists, show your value, show your knowledge, show your judgment, show your empathy for the American people, and I think that would be a great thing for him.
It's not just lawmakers. Democratic donors telling NBC News they are not convinced by the Biden campaign's reassurances. And with post-debate polling rolling in, showing early signs of a potential erosion in support for the president. Joining me now is Aaron Gilchrist. He's at the White House, and Sahil Kapoor is on Capitol Hill. Aaron, let's start with you. We do have the first public call from a sitting Democratic lawmaker for the president to step aside, but the campaign says that he's staying in. How are they now working to reassure Democratic donors and voters?
Yeah, that really is the core of the effort that we're seeing from the campaign right now, Ryan. Aside from doing the normal things that a campaign would be doing right now, we've heard about these calls with donors. We've heard about contacts with different lawmakers and people within the Democratic Party, trying to reassure them that that the campaign is not discounting their concerns, that what they saw last Thursday night with President Biden at the debate was a real thing, that they acknowledged that he had a bad debate, but that that was sort of a one-off. It wasn't an example of an ongoing problem that they anticipate the president will have. And so to help bolster that argument, we've heard the campaign offer, for example, donation numbers, the fundraising numbers for the last quarter, $264 million raised in the second quarter of this year. They pointed out that there were more than $30 million raised since the debate, or since Thursday of last week, showing that there is still support at the grassroots level, in particular, for what President Biden is trying to put forward. We also heard from Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, just a little while ago, outlining some additions to the president's schedule this week. He will be doing a sit-down interview on Friday in Wisconsin with ABC News. He also plans to talk, we understand, with leaders on Capitol Hill sometime this week. Congressman Jim Clyburn suggesting that a meeting with him, or a call at least, could happen today. There will also be a video call, we understand, with Democratic governors, including President Biden, and an event on Sunday in Philadelphia. The White House press secretary also telling us that the president will do a news conference next week during the NATO summit here in Washington, D.C., suggesting that that would likely be a solo news conference. So, Ryan, the suggestion here now that the president is going to be getting out there, as so many politicos and strategists have suggested he needs to do at this point.
Okay, Aaron, thank you for that. Let's head down Pennsylvania Avenue to Sahil Kapoor, who's on Capitol Hill now. So, Sahil, explain to our viewers who may not be directly familiar with Congressman Doggett, just to kind of put into context who he is. He's, of course, the first Democrat to ask for the president to withdraw. How significant is it that he took this step?
Well, it's significant, Ryan, because he's the first, and this is something that many congressional Democrats have thought privately. We've spoken to a number of them who have said they believe the president should step down, but Lloyd Doggett becomes the first one to say so publicly. He is a long-serving Democrat from a safe blue district based in Austin, Texas. He's 77 years old himself. He has served since 1995. He's the second-ranked Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee, one of the most powerful on Capitol Hill, and he seems to be giving voice to something that a lot of congressional Democrats think privately but are unwilling to say. He talked about various things in terms of why he wants President Biden to step down. Of course, the debate performance was not reassuring to him. He talked about that Supreme Court immunity decision, between that and the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency. He spoke of a kind of a descent into authoritarianism if President Biden doesn't step down and make way for someone who Doggett believes would be better. And then, of course, Doggett mentioned a former president, Lyndon Johnson. Let's show this quote. He talked about how Lyndon Johnson made the surprising decision in 1968, to step aside. Doggett says, quote, "I represent the heart of a congressional district once represented by Lyndon Johnson under very different circumstances. He made the painful decision to withdraw. President Biden should do the same," unquote. Very notably, Ryan, Johnson announced that in March of 1968. This is now July, and that's one of the arguments that President Biden and his campaign, his advisors, have been making to supporters, that there's no apparatus in place for a replacement if he were to step down now.
So to that point, Sahil, do we sense that this could be the crack in the dam? Will the floodgates open here? Or would Doggett be taking this step without being confident that maybe he'll be joined by others? Is he on an island right now?
Well, yes and no. In terms of other members of Congress, there's nobody else who has explicitly called on President Biden to withdraw yet, but there are other prominent Democrats who have said he should go. That includes Adam Frisch, who's a candidate for a major congressional district in Colorado, the 3rd District. He came within a few hundred votes of beating Lauren Boebert last time around. He's a closely watched candidate who Democrats are putting a lot of stock in. Julian Castro, a cabinet secretary in the Obama-Biden administration, sat in those cabinet meetings meetings with Joe Biden, said the president needs to step down, that there are other Democrats who can do better. And just in the last few minutes, Ryan, Congressman Jared Golden, a Democrat who represents a red district in Maine, put out an op-ed in his local paper, kind of an unusual op-ed, saying he expects Donald Trump to win this presidency, even though he won't be voting for Donald Trump, and dismissed the idea that Trump would derail American democracy, said U.S. democracy is strong enough to survive Donald Trump.
Yeah, he didn't call on Biden to step down, but basically said he doesn't think he can win. The private, now public calls to withdraw have also been met with the question, if it's not President Biden, then who's it going to be? Interestingly, today, Congressman Clyburn was asked about that. He actually said he'd support Vice President Harris in that scenario. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I will support her if he were to step aside. But I want to support her going forward at some time in the future. I want this ticket to continue to be Biden-Harris. And then we'll see what happens after the next election. No, this party should not in any way do anything to work around Ms. Harris. We should do everything we can to bolster her, whether it's in second place or at the top of the ticket.
There are a few Democrats as close with President Biden as James Clyburn. He's a campaign co-chair. Should we be reading into the fact that he's even dwelling on this hypothetical?
Well, we should only be reading into it to the extent that Jim Clyburn seems to be calling off any of the other candidates who might be trying to jockey for that position if Joe Biden has to step aside. But Clyburn made abundantly clear he doesn't want Biden to step aside, that it should still be a Biden-Harris ticket. But Clyburn's remark in that his warning is still very notable because Clyburn is a very powerful Democrat in a very powerful state. South Carolina was crucial to Joe Biden's nomination in 2020. It's even more important now because it's been moved further up the calendar. But beyond that, I wouldn't read too much into it. I think Clyburn is not ready to give up on Joe Biden. And Biden himself seems to have bought a little bit of time with other Democrats with that interview that he has announced on Friday. This is what multiple Democrats have been telling our team, Ryan, that he's got to get out there in non-teleprompter settings, that he's got to be unscripted and show that he can do this, that he's still got it.
Okay, Sahil, thank you for that perspective. Let's talk now about the data by turning to Steve Kornacki, who joins me from the big board with the latest poll numbers. So, Steve, yesterday you'd mentioned that there are some brand new head-to-head polls out of New Hampshire, but we now also have some new national polling. What kind of insight does this give us? Is the race moving at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've got 3 polls now, last 24 hours, all conducted after the debate. Just go through them here. And you can see a couple things. You're not seeing major shifts in these polls, but of course, in a race like this, it wouldn't take a major shift to be pretty decisive. CNN poll released this afternoon, Trump 49, Biden 43. Now, obviously, a 6-point lead for Trump. That's very eye-catching here. Keep in mind, though, last time CNN polled this race, this was back in April, some time ago, but the last time they polled this race, they also found 49-43. When they found this result back in April, that then was the biggest margin Trump was leading by in any poll at that time. A lot of other polls then were much closer. This was largely dismissed as an outlier poll. Now, could this one be too? We'll see as more polls come out in the coming days. One thing to keep in mind, when you get an outlier, often it's the result of sort of a statistical blip with your sampling. It can happen from time to time, but when that happens, you'd usually expect that the next poll wouldn't have the same problem. So could this be 2 outliers, or is this perhaps more accurately measuring right now than back in April in the CNN poll? Because the other thing to keep in mind in the CNN poll is that question of Kamala Harris. They tested as well Harris against Biden. So again, you see Trump leading Biden, Harris against Trump, excuse me. You see Trump leading Biden 49-43. When you put Harris in this poll, that 6-point gap for the Democrats comes down to 2 points. So they have Harris doing better than Biden. They also, CNN did, it checked 3 other Democrats against Trump. None of them were beating Trump, but all of them were closer than Biden. 4 Democrats in total that CNN polled. So that's a little context for that 6-point margin in the Trump-Biden race in their poll. You mentioned it. I'm sorry. This is the Suffolk USA Today poll. This, a national poll, also new today. Now, again, this poll, you see Trump with a 3-point advantage over Biden. Notice they included Kennedy. They included a number of other third-party candidates. It's why these totals for Trump and Biden are a bit on the low end, just generally speaking. But they have Trump ahead by 3 points in their new poll today. Again, entirely post-debate. Compare it to their pre-debate poll. They had it tied. So they've gone from a tie to a 3-point edge for Donald Trump. And then you mentioned, we showed this yesterday just as it came out, this New Hampshire poll, Trump over Biden. Again, the context for this, taken entirely after the debate, is there had been 4 previous polls in New Hampshire since last December. Not been a ton of Biden-Trump polling, but there had been 4 before this. And those 4 polls showed Biden ahead by 3. They showed Biden ahead by 5, Biden ahead by 6, and Biden ahead by 10. This is the only poll that's come out in New Hampshire since December that has Trump ahead in the state, and it's entirely post-debate.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for breaking that down. And we are fortunate now to be joined on set by Democratic Congressman from Virginia, Gerry Connolly. Congressman, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. I want to talk to you a little bit about a conversation you had with my NBC News colleague, Scott Wong, earlier today. And you said that you have a very direct message for the Biden campaign team. You say they need to resolve doubts, that they need to work harder and a lot harder to resolve those doubts. Otherwise, this is lethal. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, all of us saw what we saw last week in the debate. It's not normal, and it looked much worse than a bad night. And if we're going to clarify that it most certainly was that and only that, then you've got to do 2 things. Well, we start with a family therapy session, and that has not happened. We need the White House talking to elected Democrats and other Democratic leaders here in Congress and around the country. That has not happened, and it needs to happen. Secondly, there has to be a plan of action for Joe Biden to be Joe Biden, get out there and show what he did in North Carolina, show what he did in the press conference on the Supreme Court ruling on immunity, presidential immunity. You know, that was the Joe Biden we recognize. And so, but you're going to have to spend a lot of time reassuring the public that that was an anomaly and that isn't a characteristic of the president in his 81st year.
Well, do you have the benefit of that time, sir? You're running up against a deadline here where you have to pick a nominee. It's only a couple of weeks away. Is there enough time for President Biden to get out from underneath this performance he had on Thursday night?
I think there can be, yes, but I also think that underscores why we have to have some family therapy.
So what do you mean by that? And what are you frustrated by that you're not getting from the campaign?
I haven't heard a thing from the White House. Not a thing since the debate. And I represent, you know, a member of the congressional delegation to a critical state for Joe Biden, Virginia. You know, we have to carry Virginia's 13 electoral votes. And paying attention to critical states and elected officials in those critical states seems to me to be absolutely top on the list, or ought to be on top of the list of the White House political staff, campaign staff, and White House staff in general. And their silence or lack of aggressive communication right now, I think, is going to lead to more Lloyd Doggetts if they're not careful.
So talk to me about that. Are you having other quiet conversations with some of your fellow members that are expressing what Congressman Doggett is saying publicly? Or is the universe of House Democrats worried about the president's future even greater than what we're seeing publicly displayed?
I think most of my colleagues, like myself, are processing what happened. And we don't want to make decisions in haste or in panic. Joe Biden is a consequential president. He's been a friend of mine. And in fact, I worked for him for 10 years. I've known him for 45. I'm not going to jettison Joe Biden based on a 90-minute debate. But I do want to be reassured that Joe Biden is capable of doing the job, wants to do the job, and that he can reassure the public to both of those things.
So what would be your breaking point then? Like, how long can you wait to get this reassurance from the White House that you feel like you haven't gotten yet?
You know, Ryan, I can't answer that. I mean, 3 days and 43 minutes? I don't know. There has to be a process. And at the end of that process, I think we will know collectively what is the right decision.
I wonder what your take is on how the White House seems to be responding to the reporting around what everyone saw on Thursday night. They're trying to dismiss it. They're accusing the media of being too tough on him in certain respects. They're not necessarily directly answering some of the tough questions that are being asked there. Is that a way to get out from underneath this?
I think those are some of the early reactions, trying to defend a difficult night. and a difficult performance. This is somebody that generates a lot of personal loyalty because of his own character and personal attributes. And so people are understandably protective of the president on that bad night. But what they have to do once you kind of get over that is allow yourself to be engaged in this sort of therapeutic process with certainly your fellow Democrats so that we can have a dialogue and arrive at an informed decision that makes sense both for President Biden and for the country.
Some of your colleagues have told me privately that one of the things they're worried about is that the cure would actually be worse than the problem that you're dealing with, that if President Biden were to step down, if it led to a brokered convention or a selection of a new nominee, is it going to be Vice President Harris? Is it someone else? Could actually be more difficult, could serve to blow up the entire party process. Is that a concern you share?
It does, and I think that's another reason why we have to have what I call family therapy among the Democratic family. There are so many permutations involving this issue. It's not a simple proposition. Well, let's replace Joe Biden with somebody else. Well, who is that person? How do you do that? How do you deny Joe Biden the nomination when he's got 3,900 pledged delegates he earned in a legitimate electoral process? So. And also, how do you make sure that you're approaching this with the dignity and respect Joe Biden has earned? And so I think we have to have that discussion before we rush to judgment about what the next steps are and who's involved in that.
Is part of President Biden demonstrating to the country that he has what it takes, doing something like taking a mental acuity test, making those results transparent, taking a physical, something along those lines? Would that be productive?
I don't know. Makes me a little leery that we are now going to be subjecting presidential candidates to mental fitness tests and psychology tests. And I mean, I think Donald Trump would certainly flunk any kind of psychiatric evaluation if he would have one. So maybe we should start there. But I do think, however, that there has to be more transparency and more information flowing to the public so that we make informed decisions about our leadership.
I wonder, too, I talked to a lot of your colleagues on Friday after the debate on Thursday, and it seemed to be the resounding opinion I got from many of them as well. Donald Trump is so bad. You know, when a comparison between Donald Trump and anyone, you'd pick anyone. Do you fear or do you wonder if some of your colleagues haven't really taken into account that there are many Americans that are willing to vote for Donald Trump, even if they aren't necessarily huge fans of his, that there's a significant, maybe even 50% of the country that is willing to vote for him, and that Democrats have to provide a viable alternative. It's not just enough to say that you think Donald Trump is a problem.
Absolutely. I think the threat Trump represents is real politically in terms of his ability to win, and that's my North Star. My North Star in this process is going to be, how do we ensure Donald Trump does not get back to the Oval Office? That's going to be my North Star, and everything else is subordinate to that.
And how often and how quickly can you have this conversation, this family therapy session? Are your leaders talking about it? Is Hakeem Jeffries, Pete Aguilar, Congresswoman Clark, are you having these conversations about the House Democrats getting together and trying to find a path forward on this?
I think there are pockets of conversation happening. They have to be engaged, however, with the White House. And not just to leadership, to rank and file. Otherwise, you're going to have people having to make decisions individually in their own silo, and that doesn't help anybody or anything. I respect individual decisions and decisions of conscience. Your reporter talked about 1968. I was in college. I remember that vividly. I was canvassing for then Eugene McCarthy against Lyndon Johnson in Wisconsin. And the reason Lyndon Johnson, among other reasons, got out of the race in March was because he was about to lose the Wisconsin primary. And no sitting president that I know of had ever lost a primary before. And so rather than have that humiliation, and on top of all the other pressures and stress, he decided to pull out. So it's a little bit of a different kind of context and situation.
So before you go, I just want to definitively on the record, at this point, you do not think it's time for the president to step aside, but you need to see more before coming to a final decision?
I have too much respect for Joe Biden and too much affection to jettison him solely based on a performance of a 90-minute debate.
Okay, Congressman Connolly, thank you for being so honest with us. I appreciate you being
My pleasure,
here.
Ron. Thank you.
Have a very nice holiday, 4th of July weekend. Coming up, we're following the record-setting hurricane as Beryl churns through the Caribbean, where it's headed and what its rapid intensification could signal for the rest of this hurricane season. But first, the political storm after yesterday's landmark Supreme Court decision, what the Trump immunity ruling could mean for the former president's legal troubles and the current president's campaign. Next, you're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The Supreme Court's decision to grant Donald Trump immunity for official acts may deal a major blow to special counsel Jack Smith's election interference case. But the decision could also delay or derail other criminal cases tied to the former president. Just a short time ago, the judge presiding over Mr. Trump's New York hush money case postponed sentencing until September at the earliest. It was supposed to take place next week. Mr. Trump requested the delay late yesterday, and the Manhattan DA's office says that it didn't oppose it. The Supreme Court decision, meanwhile, also complicates Mr. Trump's Georgia election interference case. NBC News legal analyst and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid explaining that the Georgia case is now subject to the same scrutiny as the federal case. I'm joined now by NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian. Also with me, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. So, Ken, let's start with you. So what is Jack Smith's plan moving forward with respect to the election interference case?
Well, they are scrutinizing this decision, and they're trying to decide how much of this can survive. I mean, what's going to happen next is that Judge Tanya Chutkan, the judge in the case, is going to have a hearing or a series of hearings or even a mini trial on the question of what among the allegations in the indictments constitutes official acts, what are private acts, what can survive, what's out. We already know a large chunk of the indictment is out, and that's the section about the Justice Department and Trump's efforts to co-opt the Justice Department. But all the rest of it is subject to the judge's order, and then that will be appealed. And so, you know, we're in for a long slog on that case.
And it seems as though the Trump campaign and the Trump legal team, which is probably not a surprise, they're going to have a very wide interpretation of what falls under the banner of official act, even suggesting that organizing a slate of fake electors was an official act, right?
That's right. Donald Trump's lawyer, during oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court, acknowledged that there were some things in that indictment that were private acts, but he said he didn't think the indictment could stand as a whole if the Supreme Court ruled the way the Supreme Court did. And, you know, conspiracy cases tell a story. It's a mosaic of evidence. And so when you knock out significant chunks of that evidence, it makes it much harder to tell that story to the jury.
Okay, let's, in fact, I was going to play a soundbite of that, but we're not going to do that now. So is Trump going to try now also to use this in almost every case he's dealing with, including the immunity case? Is he going to try and assert immunity in the classified documents case as well? He's going to try and find a way to use this in every case that he's dealing with?
Yeah, of course. Most people think that he will file some kind of motion arguing that that whole case should be tossed because to the extent to which the documents were transferred from the White House while he was still president, which I think it's most of them, that he's going to say that was an official act somehow, that was the president gathering up his records, and that everything that happened after that, including allegations of obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, that's all moot. That's not reviewable because it started with an official act.
Okay, let's move to Vaughn now. So, Vaughn, what's the latest view from the Trump campaign amid the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling?
Right. If you start, number one, just with the New York trial, the sentencing for Donald Trump was slated for this upcoming Thursday, July 11th. And, you know, this goes beyond the federal election interference case, but it has to do with the verdict that came out just 1 month ago here in Lower Manhattan. And for Donald Trump and his attorneys, just hours after the decision from the Supreme Court, they sent a letter to Judge Merchan, who was overseeing the New York trial, and requested the opportunity to put forward a motion with briefs that would make the case not so much that the actual charges against Donald Trump were protected under immunity or the actions that he took, which I think were quite clearly more likely to be private acts than official acts as it pertained to the hush money scheme to pay off Stormy Daniels. But this was had to do with the evidence that was brought before those 12 jurors in New York. And some of the evidence that Donald Trump's attorneys are claiming to have been potentially come through official acts. That includes speeches that Donald Trump delivered, through tweets that, under the decision from the Supreme Court, the defense attorneys for Donald Trump would like to at least make to Judge Merchan as having been official acts and therefore should have never been presented before the jury. So there is the potential, per Judge Merchan's own letter here this afternoon, that he is willing to take that under consideration as part of a motion and is therefore delaying sentencing.
So how is the campaign using this in their messaging? Is this going to be something that they're going to show their voters that there's now doubt that's being raised about this conviction?
Absolutely. They're calling this a victory. Donald Trump is saying, the way that he's characterizing it is a spanking of Jack Smith, the special counsel. And oftentimes the social media statements that are coming from the former president are often lacking a lot of the context that actually led to a decision like this from the Supreme Court. Yet for him, it is a part of a broader message that he is being unfairly tried and that the charges against him should have never been brought in the first place. And frankly, for him and his campaign, the American public are seeing, not only in Georgia, the delay of the case having to do with the election interference in Georgia, but they are also now seeing potentially not only some of the evidence that can be brought forward as part of the federal election interference case, but potentially some of these charges being challenged and ultimately the entire indictment potentially being on the line for Donald Trump. And so for him and his campaign, this feeds in just less than 4 months until the general election into an idea that, the courts ultimately have his side and have, pushed back on some of the efforts of prosecutors in their indictments and their attempts to charge him.
And what is the campaign currently thinking about President Joe Biden and the potential that he may be pushed out of the race?
This for the Trump campaign is something, I was talking to Chris LaCivita, who's one of the senior advisors. I was talking to him after the debate, and the messaging has been echoed by Donald Trump himself on social media, and that is that there's only one person who can decide whether the Democrats go in a different route, and that's Joe Biden. And they have pushed the idea that Joe Biden will not leave this race. And frankly, they feel like they have a competitor who they feel comfortable going up in a matchup against. The polling across battleground states has shown them to be beating Joe Biden, if not at least in a close race with Joe Biden. And Donald Trump is, over the course of now really his entire political life, has tried to portray himself as a political figure of strength, right? From somebody who can, fix things. I alone can fix it was the convention speech he gave 8 years ago. Of course, he's talked about being dictator for a day. Really, strength is a character trait that he has tried to portray, and we often hear from voters on the road as to why they find Donald Trump appealing. And Donald Trump, in a social media post just in the last 24 hours, suggested that this is a matchup over strength versus weakness. So on one hand, they feel like they have an opponent that they are eager and ready to match up against. On the other hand, there's a lot of question marks as to if the Democrats were to go a different route, who would that be? Would it be a Kamala Harris? Would it be one of the governors from a battleground state? And that is where it really becomes a big open variable for a team that has tens of millions of dollars to spend against an opponent who would otherwise be undefined.
Okay. Vaughn Hilliard, Ken Delaney, thank you both. I appreciate it. Up next, we're diving deeper into the politics of this historic moment and the call coming from inside the House for Biden to withdraw for the 2024 presidential race. The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press.
I would take Joe Biden on his worst day at age 86, so long as he has people around him like Avril Haines, Samantha Power, Gina Raimondo supporting him over Donald Trump any day.
Welcome back. That was the former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson making his case for President Biden earlier today on MSNBC, essentially saying that Joe Biden in any condition would do a better job leading the country than Donald Trump. For more on all of this, I'm joined by my panel, Akayla Gardner. She's a White House correspondent at Bloomberg. Simone Sanders Townsend, a former spokesperson for Vice President Harris and the co-host of The Weekend on MSNBC. And Matt Gorman, a former senior advisor to Tim Scott's presidential campaign. So, Akayla, I don't know if we would describe Secretary Johnson's endorsement of President Biden as a ringing one there. Pretty much anybody can be surrounded by good people in the Oval Office, and they're not going to be in their 80s. I mean, what do we we take from this, and what do we take in general about the reaction from people that are actually out there to try and support President Biden at this moment?
I think this is really the second page of this conversation, is voters are really going to start looking at people like the vice president and wondering if they're going to be able to take over the helm of this administration should something happen to Joe Biden. And I think that's exactly what's happening now. We saw that CNN poll with Harris potentially performing better than Donald Trump. I think the administration and the campaign is going to have to ensure that there's trust in Harris and as well as the people around Biden. And I think that Biden has continued to talk about that. He says he's confident in his aides. But at the end of the day, there's no strategy for making up for the fact that the president is 81. And I think voters are concerned about that, and it's potentially demoralizing.
And they're now circulating an internal poll showing that they believe, their poll shows that that he's only narrowly trailing Trump. But if you're circulating a poll that shows you losing, that's probably not a good sign, is it?
Yeah, that debate certainly didn't help Biden. They're arguing that it hasn't hurt them. They believe that the race hasn't changed very much. But it's been very interesting to see the Biden campaign really talk about polling in general. Some days they say they don't look at it, they don't pay attention to it, but seemingly when it serves them, they are certainly touting it.
Yeah, so Simone, we obviously have the first Democratic lawmaker to call for President Biden to leave the race, and that's Lloyd Doggett of Texas. Is this the dam breaking? Is there going to be more that follow, or will he be out by himself for a while?
I think it's too early to tell, actually, Ryan. But, I mean, to be clear, we have all heard from people who are, some of them elected officials, and Lloyd Doggett is just the first person to put his name to the statement. And so I do think, I've long been a proponent. When I worked at the White House, I think there's a quote of me somewhere saying that people who are anonymous leakers, they need to put their name on the statement if they feel free. So I believe in people putting their name on the statement. And so the congressman did that. And I think that I would prefer to have a conversation out in the open than a conversation behind doors in secret with the people smiling in your face and anonymously saying, I want him out. So I don't know if the dam is breaking per se, but I will say what I heard Jay Johnson say this morning, I was struck by, because I was in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania on Sunday. Melissa Murray and I were doing some conversations with black women in the suburbs. And one of the women in our conversation, our discussion, said exactly what Jay Johnson said. And we'll have some sound out from this soon, but she said, well, I'm not ready to dump the president. He will have good people around him. And I think democracy, unprompted, they brought up democracy, is on the line. Now, Montgomery County is also the site of Joe Biden's speech launching his campaign this year. So there you go.
Is that enough, Matt? Is the argument that he's going to have good people around him? I mean, I could.
Thank God for Avril Haines, then. No, look, let's go back to the point here. The whole point of this debate was not to keep the race a status quo. It was to fundamentally upend the trajectory of the race, which when they started this gambit in May, he was down kind of a consistent 3 or so points. The whole point was to upend the narrative and shake this race up. So having, him not just have not lost too much ground is a complete failure of the strategy here. And I think what we're seeing is that you had about 5 or so days of quietness, certainly, but the dam might not be breaking, but it's damn close to breaking. You know what I mean? Even with the equivocation we saw from Nancy Pelosi this morning, others, it is a very tenuous time. They had a window to try and block it. They haven't done it.
Yeah, well, one of the names we had been watching on Capitol Hill was Congressman Gerry Connolly of Maine. He's always somewhat of a Democratic outlier. He represents a red district. He's certainly a blue dog. He has what I would describe as an interesting op-ed that he just posted in his hometown paper. And he writes, there are winners and losers in every election. The Democrats' post-debate hand-wringing is based on the idea that a Trump victory is not just a political loss, but a unique threat to our democracy. I reject the premise. Unlike Biden and many others, I refuse to participate in a campaign to scare voters with the idea that Trump will end our democratic system. He doesn't call on Biden to drop out. He also says he's not going to vote for Trump, but he thinks that Trump's going to win. Matt, I'm interested in your take on this, because the Democrats tell us time and time again that Americans believe there's an existential choice here, one that we're kind of in a Y in the road in the future of our country. And if Donald Trump wins, the Y is going to take us to a bad place. Gerry Connolly, a Democrat, is undercutting that argument.
He certainly is. I think it's a little bit of a too cute by half thing that Gerry Connolly's trying to do here. That he's not doing this in an interview per se where he can ask a follow-up question. It's a little too cute by half, but that's a lot of his hallmark. I will say this, right? With the democracy argument has a better rejoinder as Republicans than it does now, right? Because if Democrats truly believe that democracy is in line, the only thing standing between the end of democracy and this country is this election, then why are you running an 81-year-old man who's essentially working as Axios reports from 10 to 4, right? Like, that is a very hard now thing for them to respond to. If their actions match their words, then they should be switching out for somebody else who can intensively defend democracy more vigorously.
Yeah. So, Kayla, you heard my interview with Congressman Connolly a few minutes ago. We also have reporting that the White House has yet to make contact with Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Senate, Hakeem Jeffries, the leader in the House. Are you surprised that there hasn't been more aggressive outreach by the White House to their fellow elected officials to kind of rally the troops and make sure everybody is still on this boat as it sails toward Election Day?
I'm not surprised. This White House is very insular, but I think the conversations that I've had, most of the concern is coming from donors. It's coming from DNC members. The Democratic establishment is really rallying around the president. We've seen Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate continue to give their support, at least publicly, but I'm not surprised they haven't made those contacts. But that is much to the frustration of many Democrats in Congress who feel like they need to have those reassurances, that there needs to be calls. Right now, again, the concern is mostly coming from donors. I know that the campaign has been having calls with donors, but again, Congress continues to be frustrated with this lack of outreach.
I'm actually shocked that the president himself, now the White House, is my understanding, has touched base with the leadership and their staff. Like Jeff Zients has been on the phone, but I am shocked that the president has not hadn't picked up the phone and called Jim Clyburn, hadn't picked up the phone and called Speaker Martin Pelosi, Leader Jeffries, Chuck Schumer. These are people he knows.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, like, Joe Biden is nothing but at the end of the day, he is many things, but he will tell you he is his best political advisor. And so I was shocked to learn that these key individuals, people who he will need to go out there and frankly defend him, because that is in fact what they are doing in their interviews and whatnot. These are the elected officials that talk to him and speak to him regularly. I've been in the room with him. I have to work with him, and they can serve as validators for his leadership. And why have they not been called? And so that was just shocking to me. But what do I know? Okay, I don't know much.
He was always the guy. I mean, remember during the sequester issue back in 2011, the Republicans were like, can we get a deal? We got to call Joe Biden. He had the relationships that the Obama White House didn't have or didn't want to use. He was always the conduit to Simone's point. It's very surprising. Yeah, it should be in theory.
Well, the thing I keep coming...
Who knew we would agree to that? I don't agree on that democracy point, but I'm going to let that go.
So I do want to make this point, though, and I tried to make this point in my interview with Congressman Connolly, is that there is a timing issue here. It seems as though Democrats, their feet are stuck in quicksand. It's a lot of hand-wringing. It's a lot of we have to have a family conversation. We got to figure it out. We got to look at the polling. We got to talk to voters. Simone, how long do they have before they make a declarative decision about what the future of this presidential race is?
Well, to be clear, the only person that can make a decision about the future of the presidential race is, in fact, Joe Biden. Like, the elected officials, the party leadership, the donors, they can say anything that they would like.
But it seems like they're not even. It sounds like they're not even doing that. And the point I'd make about that is, yes, I agree with you. Why hasn't Joe Biden called Chuck Schumer?
No, I mean that Joe Biden is the only person that can decide about the future.
But if Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, 4 or 5, Barack Obama got Joe Biden in a room, demanded an audience with him, and said, if you don't get out, we're going to lose, wouldn't that change the conversation quite a bit? And there doesn't seem to be an effort to make that happen.
From my experience with the president, I don't think that would make a difference. You know what would sway the president? Voters. Voters and people in districts that have heard from real people coming and talking to them about what he actually heard. Elected people whose actual lives are on the line. A call from political lives are on the line. A call from President Obama, with all due respect to President Obama, is not going to sway Joe Biden. You know, this is not a...
It might do the opposite.
Honestly, it might do the opposite and harden him and dig his heels in. And so the only person that can make a decision about remaining in the race is Joe Biden. And thus far, he has said he is in this race and the people around him have. To the timing issue that you noted, I will just say this. Let's just say Joe Biden does say, hey, you know, I'm out. I do not think, I bet my bottom dollar, I don't think he'd say that before actually accepting the nominating in the convention. Because saying that before means it's a 4,000 delegate free-for-all. Right. Saying it after, a couple people going to decide who the nominee is.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Great conversation, though, guys. Kayla, Simone, Matt, thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. Next, we are tracking Hurricane Beryl as the dangerous storm breaks records and barrels toward Jamaica. NBC meteorologist Bill Cairns joins us next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Hurricane Beryl has been downgraded to a Category 4 storm, but forecasters say it still has the potential to devastate parts of the Caribbean. Beryl now has sustained winds of 155 miles per hour and is on track to bring heavy rains, life-threatening winds, and flooding. Forecasters say that it'll pass near Jamaica tomorrow before approaching the Cayman Islands on Thursday. Beryl is already being blamed for at least 4 deaths in the Caribbean. At one point, it was a Category 5 hurricane with 165-mile-per-hour winds. making it the strongest July hurricane ever recorded. NBC News meteorologist Bill Cairns joins me now. So, Bill, update us. What's Beryl's latest track?
Yeah, Ryan, we're actually lucky. We're getting in the new advisory, the 5 o'clock East Coast advisory from the Hurricane Center as we speak. I just saw the new track. It was just posting. Still waiting to see if this is the latest data on the current conditions. You notice the eye not as well defined. This is expected. We thought it would peak last night or early this morning, and now the wind shear, that's the upper level winds, are starting to tear it apart a little bit. So it's going to be a slow weakening process, but it's moving so fast. It's only 18 hours or so away from Jamaica. I mean, it doesn't have enough time to weaken without being a devastating storm for the island. So the Hurricane Center forecast path does take it right along that south shore of Jamaica, 125-mile-per-hour wind. So a major Category 3 hurricane. The last time Jamaica had a Category 3 major hurricane or greater landfall was going back to 1988. So this could be a rare event for Jamaica and a possibly devastating one with the mountainous terrain, the wind, and also the torrential rain. And here's what else is new. Now we have Brownsville and Corpus Christi in that cone of uncertainty. So by the time we get towards Sunday at noon, the storm could be inland somewhere here, north of Veracruz near Tampico, kind of similar to Alberto, or it could be heading and starting to curve up here towards South Texas. Notice the Hurricane Center, they weaken it down to a tropical storm. The winds are going to be very harsh. We don't think it's going to be a devastating storm for Cancun, Belize, or Cozumel, wherever it moves inland here. But as it heads back over the warmer water, the winds may relax a little bit. The Hurricane Center does hint at it getting a little bit stronger. So, Ryan, our friends in South Texas over the next couple of days need to prepare just in case the storm heads your way, anywhere from a strong tropical storm to a lower-end hurricane.
All right, Bill Cairns, thank you for that update. We appreciate it. After the break, making sense of this history-making moment and what comes next as the Supreme Court dramatically expands the scope of presidential power and as the sitting president faces a crisis of confidence. Historian Michael Beschloss joins me to put it all in perspective. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Take a deep breath. It's been a couple of chaotic days here in Washington that will undoubtedly go down in the history books as some of the most consequential moments in the 2024 presidential election. As Democrats grapple with their path forward after a disastrous debate performance by President Biden, and as Republicans tout that landmark Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity that could fundamentally reshape the office of the presidency. For more now, I'm joined by NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, thank you so much for being here. Let's first talk about this presidential election. Maybe it seems like a redo of 2020 on paper, but just how unusual is this moment in the presidential race? I mean, what do you make of the seismic impact things like this debate and Supreme Court ruling could have on this election?
Well, Ryan, before Thursday night, you had one candidate, Donald Trump, who was promising to be a dictator for a day and completely change a lot of our style of government, and incumbent President Joe Biden, about whom people had doubts about his ability to serve for 4 more years. Then you've got the debate on Thursday night, which exacerbated a lot of those fears. And then that ruling by the Supreme Court, it was only yesterday. It seems already about 2 weeks ago, doesn't it? It's amazing. But the Supreme Court that essentially says that whoever is president in January will take an oath to an office that is probably more powerful than any president in American history. Those are the stakes.
And what do you think that could mean for future presidents, knowing now that they have this broader immunity? And we're not just talking about Donald Trump. It could be anyone who inhabits the office.
Already presidents have an awful lot of power. They can, as you know, press the button and fire off nuclear weapons, conceivably cause the death of much of the planet, if not all. And at the same time, as going to war, they have all sorts of other powers over the Department of Justice and others over the Defense Department. So that was true already. But now you've got a situation where the last constraint on presidential power has basically been ripped off, because one of them in the Constitution was impeachment and conviction. Well, that's never happened in over 2 centuries. And I think in our own time, impeachment has become toothless. Mm-hmm. So essentially, you've relied on the fact that presidents such as Richard Nixon were nervous about doing something terrible when people were not looking, like obstructing justice, as he did in 1972, because he might be prosecuted and sent to jail. That constraint is gone, too. We're going to be living in a different country.
Meanwhile, you have President Biden here trying to put concerns about his age at bay. Members of his own party openly speculating as to whether or not he has the mental and physical ability to do the job. Is there a historic parallel to what the Democrats are dealing with right now? And how unbelievable would it be if they were forced to replace their nominee?
Well, in 1984, there were whispers that Ronald Reagan's mental fitness was not what it had been. He was able to dispel a first bad debate with a joke and a second bad debate. But that, Ryan, was the world of 1984. That just doesn't happen nowadays. So I think from the part of view of the Democrats, this is healthy because there's a process. They're going to re-examine who this choice is going to be at a moment that it can still be decided once again. Can you imagine if this happened the second week of October? Yeah. Totally different situation.
So the president also facing criticism for keeping his circle so small, only listening to a handful of advisors. Can that be detrimental to a presidency?
Sure it can. And if we find that the debate performance, for instance, on Thursday night was because of a circle that was too small, that did not manage him well, that's something that people should think about. At the same time, these were the same advisors that gave us a lot of what is a very strong presidential record.
Michael Beschloss, we're very fortunate to have someone of your expertise to talk us through these historic few days. Have a very wonderful 4th of July. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Love it. Same to you, Ryan.
And we're going to be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press now, but NBC News coverage continues with Hallie Jackson, who has an interview with Congressman Lloyd Doggett, the first sitting member of the House Democrats to call on President Biden to step down. You don't want to miss that. Thank you for watching Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.